Hello everybody. Today what we're going to do is talk about fly lines, a little bit about what fly lines are so that you can have a little more information before you go into a fly shop and decide to buy a fly line. There are lots of fly lines. You walk into the typical fly shop and there are hundreds of fly lines, dozens and dozens of different kinds and colors and sizes and shapes, and it's really confusing to figure out which one to buy. So we're hoping that this video will give you a little clarity in terms of fly lines. Some of the fly line differences are basically marketing differences. In other words, there are some fly lines that are almost identical, and one is marketed as a bass fly line and another one as a musky fly line or something like that. But there are a lot of really significant and important differences which we're going to talk about, which determine what line you ought to buy for your particular situation. So we're going to divide this into some parts. The first one is some basic rules. What do they mean when they say a 6-weight? What does that mean? A 7-weight fly line, a 5-weight fly line, or whatever. The other thing we're going to do is talk about the parts of a line. The most commonly purchased fly line right now is a weight forward taper, and we'll talk about that and what that means. There's a couple other types, but they're not very commonly used anymore. Then the physical properties. What kind of core does a fly line have? What kind of coating does a fly line have? And how does that affect the performance of the fly line and possibly which fly line you choose? We're also going to talk about how fly lines match with reels and rods. So we'll try to have put it together sort of in a synergistic way so you can understand the relationship between fly lines, rods, and reels and the kinds of fishing you do. And lastly, we're hoping to just clarify a little bit about which fly line you might want to consider buying given your particular situation. So that's what we're going to be doing. It's a little more complicated than a lot of people think it is, but we're going to try to simplify this so that it makes, some pretty good sense. Let's talk a little bit about the properties of a fly line in terms of what they mean by a 4-weight, a 5-weight, a 6-weight. Every fly line what we do is we weigh the first 30 feet of a fly line, and that determines the weight that we label it with. That was determined back in the 1960s, and of course there's been a lot of changes in fly rods since the 1960s. So fly rods that are a 6-weight are supposed to match with a 6-weight fly line, but that's not always the case, and I'm hoping that we can make some sense out of that for you. For instance, a 7-weight fly line is supposed to weigh, according to the original standards 50, 60 years ago, 185 grains. And a 8-weight would weigh about 210 grains, and a 9-weight, for instance, would weigh 140, a 5-weight 240, and a 5-weight around 140 grains. So when you have 30 feet of fly line, that's what they're supposed to weigh. Now, what happens though is that the only thing that really matters in a fly line is how much weight is out of the tip. So if you've got a 6-weight fly rod and you're going to only cast 20 feet, you've only got 20 feet of fly line out of that tip. And you may need, with a stiffer rod and a line with a long taper, which we're going to talk about in a little while, you may well need, if you're casting 15 or 20 or 30 feet with your fly line, and you've got a fairly long leader on it, you may well want to put a 7 or an 8-weight on your 6-weight rod in order to make that cast. By the same token, if that same rod, that 6-weight rod, you're making huge long casts, you may want to put a 6-weight on it. You could even conceivably put a 5-weight on it, because remember, the only thing that determines the bend in a rod is the weight of the line against the motion of the rod. So the more that line weighs, the more weight that is out of the tip, the more your rod is going to bend. So not all 6-weight rods are going to function best at your particular distance with a 6-weight line. It may be that a 7-weight line is better. I know when I go to fish in Louisiana for redfish, I have an 8-weight rod and I use a 10-weight line because I'm making short casts, really short sometimes, maybe 15 feet. I need a lot of weight out of that tip to bend that rod tip as quickly as I can. I seldom make a cast more than 40 feet. So my rod easily handles a 10-weight line for those kinds of casts. Now, if I was in a distance contest and wanted to cast 100, 110 feet or 115 feet, I would never choose a 10-weight line for that. So think about the distance you're going to be casting, and then we'll talk about the type of fly you're going to be casting. But the kind of line that you have on your rod is determined by your rod, first off. If your rod bends more easily, it's quite possible you can use a lighter weight line. If your rod, if your casting is longer or shorter, that's going to determine it. And even the speed of your casting stroke. If you've got a really fast casting stroke speed, you're going to load that rod better with a similar line to a person who's got a slower casting speed and the same line. So there's a lot of different considerations. My general rule of thumb when I'm guiding, almost all of my guiding rods they have a 6-weight has a 7-weight on it, a 5-weight has a 6-weight on it, because most of our fishing is 30 to 40 feet, and most casters are not particularly good at feeling the bend in the rod. And I want them to be able to feel the bend in the rod so they can know when their fly, for instance, is behind them, and they can feel the cast. So we overline our rods by 1 most of the time, but that doesn't mean that's necessary, but it's often the case. And a lot of manufacturers now, for instance, many 7-weight lines, they could be 195 grains instead of 185 grains, because they're compensating for the fact that a lot of modern rods are a lot stiffer. So they're going to need a little more weight to balance that line or that rod. Another thing people do is you can cut off some of the front taper, which we're going to talk about. So if you cut a foot of the front taper off, you're replacing it with a foot of the belly, which you'll see in the next segment. That means instead of having X amount of weight in that 1 foot, you've replaced it with a lot more weight, maybe X times 2 or 3. So you get a lot more weight out with the same line. So you could cut off a foot. For instance, we use a fly line that has an 11-foot front taper. I sometimes cut off 2 feet, which means that instead of that 2 feet of very light line, I've replaced it in essence with 2 feet of belly, which is much, much heavier. So that makes that whole line cast considerably different. So that's a little bit about lines and how we determine the weight of lines and what a line means for you. And remember, most manufacturers now, many lines are a size or half a size bigger than the line that they tell you on the box. In the old days, fly lines were called a level taper. They just made the whole fly line the same diameter from the beginning to the end. Today, very, very few people use a level tapered fly line because they're just not very efficient at conducting energy the way we want them to. So there are today, some people use a double taper fly line, but we're not going to talk about that too much. But we are going to talk about a weight forward taper, which is most commonly used by probably 90% of anglers today, one variety or another of a weight forward taper. So we're going to show you first the basic structure of a weight forward taper in a sort of rough diagram, and then come back so you'll have a visual idea of what the 4 parts of the taper are. This is the front taper. So this is the front part of the fly line, and it's somewhere between 3 and 11 feet long, and the purpose of that is to dissipate the energy at different rates depending on the size of the fly and the presentation you want to have. This middle part is the belly, and that belly is designed to provide the weight for the most part and to store energy in your cast. And that belly sometimes in some fly lines is as short as 10 or 12 or 14 feet, and some fly lines it may be as long as 20 feet, depending on the purpose, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is the rear taper. It tapers down in the back. Some fly lines, that rear taper is very short, 4 or 5 feet. Some tapers are as long as 11 or 12 feet. And without that long taper, you can't throw long distances really accurate because you get a thing called a hinge, which we'll talk about in a minute. The last part of a fly line is just a running line. It's a really skinny piece of fly line. I mean, in essence, you could almost cut it off and you'd have what we call a shooting head. You're just going to throw your backing instead of your fly line. But that can be anywhere, you know, who knows? That could be somewhere between almost up to 70 feet long. And it's just a little skinny running line. So the problem is that if you were to have this rear taper outside of your tippy top, in other words, your rod was all the way out, your line was all the way out, so your tippy top was right here, and this was hanging off the tip of your rod, that's going to be tough, because what happens is you get a hinge effect, you lose all your energy, and it's hard to hold that up unless you're casting very, very fast. So most people can't cast a short, this whole thing together is called the head of the fly line. This is the whole thing, and that's going to be made up of 4 parts. So let's talk about each one of those parts. If you've got a front taper that's really long and you want to cast it's going to dissipate energy really slowly. So if you've got a tiny fly and you want to present a size 22 fly to a fish on a spring creek and you've got a 12-foot leader, that's going to be good because it's going to slowly turn that thing over. It's not going to just boom and power it down. By the same token, you might want a very short front taper if you're throwing bass bugs, big flies to muskie or pike, big streamers to different kinds of fish. You're going to want a shorter taper because that shorter taper is going to take a lot less time for it to impart the energy into the fly. It's going to turn over bigger flies easier. So consider what kind of flies you're going to be throwing. If you're going to be throwing big flies in windy situations, you're probably going to want a short front taper. If you're going to throw delicate flies and you want them to be presented delicately and land on the surface slowly, you're going to want a very small or a long front taper. Then you got the belly. The belly is the part of the line that basically provides the weight that bends the rod. So that belly is, most bellies are pretty much, they're fairly similar in that they're not super differences between different sizes of bellies. But you're going to want a belly that's going to be maybe 14 to 20 feet long. If you're throwing long distances, then you're going to want a longer belly. If you're going to throw short distances, you're going to want a shorter belly, and then you're going to want a short rear taper because the rear taper isn't, let's say you're fishing for redfish. A typical redfish taper is around 30 feet long. The whole taper, the whole front section of the fly line is 30 feet long. It's got a very short front taper, it's got a belly and a short rear taper. You get that thing close to the end, you got 25 feet of line out of your tippy top guide, and man, you got a lot of weight that's just going to fly. And then everything else is going to be skinny so that weight can pull. So you can make quick shots very quickly to a fish that's cruising along. You've got 2 false casts to get 50 feet. It's just bam, bam, boom, you shoot. Whereas same token, if you want to shoot 80-foot casts, which is unusual in fishing, by the way, you'd want a much longer front taper, a longer belly, and a really long rear taper, unless you can shoot a lot of line very fast. So part of the kind of taper that you pick is going to be determined on your casting style. If you're good at shooting line, developing line speed, you can use a shorter front taper, or a shorter taper in general, a shorter head length. But if you need to take a lot of casts, you're going to need a taper that's going to be long enough. The whole taper needs to be long enough for you to make those front casts. The other thing is, if you're roll casting a lot, you can't roll cast 60 feet. With an entire front head. Your whole head of that fly line is 35 feet long. You're into the overhang, into the running line. You're not going to be able to roll cast. So people that have a redfish line, let's say, and it's got a 30-foot front head on it, you got the whole front of your taper system is 30 feet long. You put that tippy top guide out, you're probably talking about 50 feet as far as you can roll cast. Otherwise, you're going to get a hinge and it's going to die. So think about the kinds of fishing you're going to do. Bone fishing tapers are 40, 42, 43 feet long because you're casting longer distances with slightly smaller flies. Big bass bug tapers are 26, 28, 30 feet. So it just depends on the kind of fishing. Ask your local fly shop what kind of taper you should use for the kind of fishing that you do most often. Otherwise, you need to buy more than one line if you want to anywhere close to optimally cast whatever it is you think you're going to cast.